Skadoosh. ¿Qué pasa, mi gente? Estamos aquí. Alright, te explico una revolución, mi gente. Dale. Okay, 1917 Germany is fucking up Russia in the First World War. I mean, the Russian Revolution in general was just like a political and social upheaval. It ended the Romanov dynasty, and like mainly it was to get rid of imperial rule in Russia. It overthrew the Tsar. The Bolsheviks rose and they established that Soviet government. So, like, what kind of situation would cause something like that to happen? You know, and so World War One already before World War One, they're on the edge of economic collapse, military disaster, and political unrest. Now, if I were to revolt, that kind of sounds like a perfect storm. Sounds like France, don't it? Yeah. So, World War One, really a breaking point for them because they were bleeding out. The army suffered massive defeats against Germany, morale was shattered, and soldiers were deserting en masse. Food shortages and supply chain breakdowns made life unbearable on the home front. Um, Economic and social collapse. The war drained resources, inflation skyrocketed, bread lines stretched for hours, factories were shutting down, workers faced starvation wages, and in the Tsarist government, out of touch and resistant to reform, they just failed to address the crisis. So, in the February Revolution, it was a pretty spontaneous uprising. It was in March 1917. If we're using our old Russian calendar, it's February, but protests were erupting in Petrograd. Shout out shout out St. Petersburg, as it's known today. What started as a strike for bread and workers' rights escalated into mass demonstrations. And this is what really got the military fed up with the war and sympathetic to like its own people, mutinied. And with the military behind you, that's how any revolt goes. You know, like within days after the military revolted, Tsar Nicholas II was abdicated. And this kind of makes us think about that semi-relevant Russia story where one of the leading Russian guys was threatened to revolt against Putin, and I don't remember what happened to him, but probably wasn't good. So anyway, I think he may have died in a plane crash. I may just be talking out my ass. So, a provisional government was set, like a weak middle ground after the Tsar. Temporary government led by moderates and liberals took charge, but they made a big mistake. They kept Russia in the war. And so, like, the Socialist Council, also known as the Soviets, formed, and they wanted radical change. So, the Bolsheviks come in by October 1917, so from March to October, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, 8 months. That's all it took was 8 months. Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks, they had the back of the workers, the soldiers, and they saw a movement. They staged a coup, overthrew the provisional government, and declared Soviet rule. What followed was civil war, Red Terror, and the birth of the USSR. And so Russia in 1917 wasn't just unstable, it was at a breaking point. The revolution wasn't a sudden event, it was an inevitable result of suffering, years of suffering, mismanagement, and war. I mean, I think this is just good to know. You know what? Let's add something else to this. It's just good to know how coups occur. How these coups occur is like, so people say January 19th or whatever was a coup, a staged coup. And I would say it failed because of the lack of military support. But as old boy, old orange gold hair, old orange face and gold hair, as his decrepit old corpse returns to the seat in power, um, these are just stuff to keep in mind. Like, if we're in war, we're pretty drained. Economic situation for the average person, the average citizen, is not good right now. And so it's just something to think about. If things get worse, think about who's in the position to seize power. Maybe somebody sitting in the throne, Oval Room, and they've got the House on their side, the Senate on their side, the fucking and the judicial branch. You all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, they've got the fucking Supreme Court, the judicial branch, executive, judicial. No, I don't know. So let's think about this. What what is it? I mean, if we break it down here and we start looking at another revolution that occurred in a similar situation, I mean, we got to talk about the French if we're talking revolutions. So the French Revolution was 89 to 99, 1789 to 1799, and like Russia in 1917, it was drowning. Like the French in the late 18th century were drowning in war, economic collapse, and again is this underlying theme in almost all of these with dissatisfaction of the government among the people, and mainly the ruling elite, because it wasn't much of a government. And so they were suffering from extreme financial instability, years of war, left the government bankrupt, inflation soared, and food shortages, especially the price of bread, pushed the common people to the breaking point. And here's the breaking point. Oh, you know what I'm saying? So the King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were infamous for the lavish spending and failure to enact reforms. This is a different time period. It's more of an aristocracy or whatever, aristocracy, whatever you want to call it. They had kings and shit. They had the ruling class, and so they refused to pay taxes, and you're just pushing that responsibility onto the starving lower class. And so France had the third estate, also known as commoners, who they wanted a say in the government. And when their calls for reform were ignored, revolutionary ideas start spreading, protests start popping up here and there, protests lead to riot, and next thing you know, full-scale revolutions in place. And just as the Russian people overthrew the Tsar, the French stormed the Bastille in 1789 and later executed King Louis XVI in 1793. In both cases, the revolutionaries sought to dismantle centuries of monarchy and establish a radical new system. That's what they wanted. And so it didn't start off that well, though, because France spiraled into a reign of terror where thousands were executed. It's actually similar to Lenin's Red Terror in Russia. after their revolution in 1917 and internal conflicts and wars against foreign powers. They turned all the revolutions violent and extreme. And so in France, Napoleon Bonaparte, maybe you've heard of him, eventually took control, ending the revolutionary chaos but replacing it with his own empire, just as Stalin did in, in Russia. But they're both fueled by war, economic collapse, an out of touch elite, and the desperate working class. They always start with promises of freedom, but quickly descend into radicalism and dictatorship. If we're going to use history as a guide, revolutions don't just randomly occur. Okay? They've got certain conditions that they need. And if we're looking at Russia in 1917 and France in 1789, the main triggers were severe economic inequality, government distrust and incompetence, civil unrest and the polarization of political views, the loyalty of the military was lost, and war as a catalyst. Both revolutions erupted when the gap between the ruling elite and the working class became unbearable. And if we're going to look at modern day US of A, in the US there is and has been a rising wealth inequality, corporate consolidation, and wage stagnation. These could all be parallels carried over into our normal world or today's world. And if inflation and economic hardship worsen while billionaires continue to flourish, unrest only becomes more and more likely. And so, if we look at the Tsar and King Louis, they ignored problems until it was too late. Sound familiar? In the US, growing political polarization is occurring. There's low trust in institutions, and gridlocked governance could signal similar instability. If people feel the system isn't working for them, they'll just look for radical alternatives. I mean, if we're looking at civil unrest and political extremes, mass protests, riot, and increasing political violence preceded both revolutions. And the US has already seen growing social movements, protests. I mean, just think about like labor strikes, BLM, January 6th, just a couple examples. Like people are getting upset, and if these tend to continue and escalate or become more violent, it's going to resemble pre-revolutionary conditions. In Russia and France, soldiers eventually sided with the revolutionaries. The U.S. military still remains stable, but if divisions deepen over whatever, if it's politics, internal conflict, economic pressure, it could be a turning point. If the military goes, it's a big turning point. And war is a catalyst. They were drained from war. While we aren't a massive ground war, economic consequences from global conflicts like Ukraine, the current situation in Taiwan, what the fuck is going down in the Middle East right now, it's all gonna add pressure. And if another major war breaks out or an economic collapse follows, conditions could ripen. But there's a bottom line here. Revolutions that happen when economic pain, government failure, and public outrage reach a breaking point. Right now, the US has ingredients, but it isn't quite at the tipping point yet. Um, but if history repeats itself, the warning signs are there.